So let's start by reading. So let's read from verse 24, where Pilate begins to hand washing through the mocking of Jesus. And quite possibly we'll also get to the crucifixion tonight, but we can read that separately if we actually get there, since I always think we're going to get somewhere where we in fact don't get, and sometimes don't even come close. So we'll just read those two sections. So chapter 27, verses 24 through 31. So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this righteous man's blood. See to it yourselves. And all the people answered, his blood be on us and on our children. Then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe upon him, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they spat upon him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him. So the first thing that I had wanted to mention is that there's Pilate's washing his hands, according to many commentators, couldn't have happened because that's a Jewish practice. And so it's part of Matthew's attempt to sort of exonerate Jesus, to exonerate Pilate, and to, kind of make him less guilty of Jesus' crucifixion than the Sanhedrin and particularly the crowd. So before we start discussing that, let's take a look at the washing of one's hands in the Old Testament. First of all, the foundational verses are Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 1, since it provides the context. If in the land which the Lord your God gives you to possess, anyone is found slain, lying in the open country, and it is not known who killed him, then your elders and your judges shall come forth, and they shall measure the distance to the cities which are around him that is slain. And the elders of the city which is nearest to the slain man shall take a heifer which has never been worked and which has not pulled in the yoke. And the elders of that city shall bring the heifer down to a valley with running water, which is neither plowed nor sown, and shall break the heifer's neck there in the valley. And the priests of the son of Levi shall come forward, for the Lord your God has chosen them to minister to him and to bless in the name of the Lord. And by their word every dispute and every assault shall be settled. And all the elders of that city nearest to the slain man shall wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken in the valley, and they shall testify, our hands did not shed this blood, neither did our eyes see it shed. Forgive, O Lord, your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, and set not the guilt of innocent blood in the midst of your people Israel, but let the guilt of blood be forgiven them. So you shall purge the guilt of innocent blood from your midst, when you do what is right in the sight of the Lord. So someone is killed, it's not known who. It's assumed that the murderer comes from the city nearest where the body is found. And so there's a heifer that's sacrificed in place of the murderer who is unknown. And then the elders of the city then wash their hands to signify that they are not guilty of innocent blood, presumably the blood of the victim who was found lying dead. And then the psalm, two psalms talk about washing my hands in innocence. Psalm 26 and Psalm 27 talks about in vain I've washed my hands. So that's the basis of the contention that this was a Jewish practice. And so Pilate couldn't possibly have done it. Although in fact, washing of hands as a sign of innocence is done in Sophocles, Ajax, and in Virgil's Aeneid. So, and so Virgil particularly is a Latin poet and writer, and a very well-known one at that. So that charge is false. But the broader question is, does washing hands indicate that Pilate, is that Matthew's motivation to indicate that Pilate is less guilty?
Well, doesn't he call the shots anyway? I mean, the people are asking for Barabbas to be released,
Uh-huh,
but doesn't he have the last word anyway?
uh-huh, right.
So,
He's the governor, which Matthew is almost using ironically because he's not governing. He's his responsibility as a judge is to judge fairly the innocent and the guilty, and he's failing to do that. His responsibility as governor is to maintain peace and order, and yet he's releasing a man who he knows is innocent in favor, he's crucifying a man who he knows is innocent in favor of a social bandit or revolutionary who poses a threat to civil order. So that makes no sense at all. Then also notice that he says, see to it yourselves, right? I am innocent of, he washes his hands and says, I am innocent of this righteous man's blood. See to it yourselves in verse 24. So see to it yourselves is the same phrase that Judas had used, or rather that the Sanhedrin had used earlier in verse 4. Judas returns the money and they say, what is that to us? See to it yourselves. So by saying that, they're implying that this is Judas's problem. It's Judas who's guilty. It's Judas who's betrayed innocent blood. It's Judas who needs to deal with that. And it's not their problem because they are innocent. And so Pilate is using the same phrase. So the implication there would be, that the basic application is the same. He's simply, very much like the Sanhedrin, simply imputed guilt onto their own guilt onto Judas, not that Judas wasn't guilty, but that didn't absolve them of anything. And in fact, it was they who set everything in motion. And similarly, Pilate is trying to absolve himself and putting it on someone else when he's the governor. And crucifixion is a Roman form of death. Crucifixion is not a Jewish form of death. The Jews cannot crucify anybody because it's a Roman form of death, and they don't have the right to impose the death penalty. Only Pilate or the Roman state can. So it strikes me that this notion that Matthew is trying to absolve Pilate somehow is completely ill-conceived and without basis, and um, just rather bizarre. So why did Pilate think that the crowd would choose Jesus? Any thoughts about that? I mean, in some way, he tried to free Jesus, but just lacked resolve and backed down.
Well, wasn't he afraid that if he, I mean, either way, there was going to be people upset about the decision made.
Mhm.
But he wanted, well,
So he miscalculated. And why might he have miscalculated?
I mean, Barabbas was a well-known guy for like making disturbance around, right?
Mhm.
And he was, I don't know, maybe he thought like, like everybody know that he brings disruption, and rather than Jesus, that in his mind didn't bring as much trouble as Barabbas did.
Mhm.
So he's like, okay, maybe they're gonna know. They know what Barabbas out there means. So maybe they're gonna choose Jesus because of that, but they didn't.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting sort of miscalculation because the Sanhedrin is basically very conservative. Right? They're walking a tightrope. So on the one hand, they are Jewish, but they don't exactly support Jewish liberation because they're working closely with the Romans. In many ways, they're dependent on Roman power. The high priest is a nominee, is an appointee of the prefect. And so endorsing either a social bandit or a revolutionary is not exactly something you would expect them to do. So there, you would think there would be a good basis for Pilate's calculation. But he was wrong. So another thing is that, I mean, generally, there were, almost certainly, I mean, I don't really know a great deal about, sort of Roman political administration and, observation of unrest, but I would assume, that it's sort of pretty much the same as it's always been, that there are, sort of police agents and informers who regularly report to, the authorities. And so there's a careful monitoring of unrest and of events that are likely to provoke unrest. And so given that, it's very likely that Pilate knew about Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, and seeing Jesus saw him as not much of a threat. So the assumption would be from his triumphant entry into Jerusalem that he was popular, which is true within some context, but not within another context. And so he entered with Galileans, predominantly in pilgrims, which is one thing. but the crowd standing before Pilate didn't consist of those pilgrims. It consisted of people from Jerusalem. So then, what else does that say about Pilate?
He doesn't know his own people, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, except they're not his own people. Right? He's Roman.
He's Roman.
So he doesn't understand the difference between Galileans and Judeans, and doesn't understand the difference between the inhabitants of Jerusalem and those from outside of the city. Because to him, and this is, a major, this is a major characteristic of both ethnocentrism and racism, that one Jew is just like every other Jew. It's kind of like, for many people, one black person is just like every other black person. Many white people can't even tell black people apart, because to them, they all look the same. So, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I didn't know the people that entered Jerusalem with Jesus was Galileans and people out of Jerusalem. That makes sense. I thought it was just the same people that kind of turned their heads at 180. Like on a Sunday, you're like, hey, Hosanna, Hosanna, and then like on a Thursday, you're like, crucify, crucify. I was like,
Yeah, it's weird.
they didn't
Yeah.
see the deed, so like they were like the people like following him everywhere, and
Right. Yeah.
if they
So,
didn't believe, at least for the show that Jesus was putting up, like he was like healing everybody and doing
right,
so much.
right. Although, in Matthew's gospel, in the synoptics, Jesus really doesn't perform miracles in Jerusalem, or many miracles in Jerusalem. And they're not really, Matthew doesn't pay much attention to them, especially since the purpose of coming to Jerusalem is to die. But, so we have some very much from the beginning of Matthew's gospel, where the Magi follow the star and come to Jerusalem. Matthew links Herod in Jerusalem and says all Jerusalem was disturbed by the rumors of the birth of the Messiah. And so he's clearly pitting Jerusalem, which is a symbol of temple Judaism, since it's where the temple is located, against the messianic aspirations of the Israelites. And so that's reflected in the Judean Galilean pilgrims entering Jerusalem. I remember Jesus is apprehended in Gethsemane at night. Night is late at night, a time of darkness, but also a time when people are asleep and there aren't as many people alert and awake and around. He's then taken to the residence of the high priest, which really isn't where people are going to be hanging out. And this is a late night proceeding. First thing in the morning, he's taken to the praetorium where Pilate is. It's unclear whether that's the fortress that's just slightly northwest of the temple, or to Herod's palace, which is further on the western wall of the city.
And it's during Passover too, right?
It's during Passover. So most of the Passover celebrants are going to be at the temple. They're not going to be, at Herod's palace or the Fortress Antonia, where one of those two locations is where Pilate is. So these are really handpicked people. And so in last week's class, we discussed Matthew is talking about the crowd. And then at the end, he says, all the people. So listen to last week's video because we discussed why he changed from crowd to all the people. It's not because of a permanent curse on the Jews, as was thought, in previous years by some Catholic interpreters, but rather it's really an eschatological statement about the end of Temple Judaism, that within the generation that's listening to him and the generation of their children, there would be a dramatic eschatological event, that being, the destruction of the temple and the separation of Christianity from Judaism, and the destruction of Temple Judaism along with the fall of the temple. So, it's by no means the case that Matthew is blaming everybody. What he is blaming is Temple Judaism and the entire system of religion associated with Temple Judaism, which was destroyed when the temple was destroyed.
Well, I thought maybe the washing of his hands was because his wife had tried to warn him that Jesus had a big following and that he was a good man too.
Yeah,
And that he should have nothing to do with.
Pilate actually uses the phrase righteous man. But the problem is that does washing his hands follow his wife's advice?
Mm-mm.
I mean,
no. It's just an act.
Right, it's just an act. So notice in Deuteronomy, with the whole hand washing thing, it's a ritual absolution of guilt, because in fact, the murderer of the victim is unknown. It's only assumed that the murderer of the victim has to be from the nearest city, but there's no evidence whatsoever of either where the murderer came from or who he or she is. And so it's assumed that it comes from the nearest city. A heifer is sacrificed from the nearest city to represent the murderer and stand in place of the murderer. And then everybody washes their hands to indicate that they're not guilty of innocent blood, because in fact, they're not guilty of innocent blood unless in the off chance one of the elders is the murderer, which, is kind of in most cases, going to be unlikely. So it's sort of a ritual act of both indicating innocence, of offering something, some sort of sacrifice for the victim who has died, and in some ways, sort of respecting the victim who has died without indicating that you yourself are responsible, because you're not responsible. But the problem with Pilate's hand washing is that he is responsible. So it's very much like Adam and Eve. I mean, Adam says, the woman made me do it. Eve says, the snake made me do it. And of course, snakes can't make you do anything other than maybe run and scream, but that's the limit of their capabilities. And Pilate is the governor. I mean, and in his capacity as governor is also the judge. So he's failed at both counts. He's convicted an innocent man who he knows to be innocent. That's the mark of a horrible judge. And he's released a dangerous bandit,
Criminal, yeah,
criminal,
yeah.
whether a criminal or a political revolutionary. I mean, whether a
I
bandit.
thought he was a murderer or something, wasn't he?
Yeah, it says so in I think Luke's gospel. But there again, who he murdered is, so if he was a social bandit, then the likelihood is that the people who he murdered were either Roman or wealthy Jews or wealthy people, travelers in the area. If he was, an insurrectionist or a revolutionary, then almost certainly the people he would have murdered are Romans. But in either case, that means that he's a murderer of the influential and wealthy or a murderer of Romans. And both of those things are bad for, social stability and, political stability in the empire. You generally don't. And even if not, even if he's merely a social bandit who hasn't killed anybody, you don't want social bandits wandering around robbing the wealthy. And, you want trade to flourish in the empire because there are taxes and you get, cut of the proceeds from taxes, and you don't want to restrain trade because it's not a good thing. So you don't want all of this unrest that undermines economic stability and undermines political stability. And so Pilate has completely failed there too. As governor, he's completely taken an action that's counterintuitive and that threatens the peace and the stability of the empire. So he's failed dramatically. And he is responsible. Everybody is responsible. There's no real point in dividing up blame into proportions. Everybody is equally responsible. Judas is responsible. The Sanhedrin is responsible, and Pilate is responsible. They've all sort of followed their own agendas that's resulted in the death of an innocent person, and they're all guilty.
Pilate gave him a choice, though, to choose between Barabbas and Jesus. I mean, did he? I'm sure he didn't know what was going to be the outcome of that choice.
Right. He was assuming that it would be Jesus who would be.
He was assuming that, right?
Not Barabbas.
So are we saying that he should have just freed Jesus and say keep the rebel, imprison the rebel? He should have done that.
Yeah.
Is that what we're saying?
He's the governor, right?
Well, he's the governor, but the tradition was two people that has been turned into him.
Yeah, although
that they get to make a choice between one or the other.
Although remember,
I understand why the crowds chose Barabbas, because
remember
he had
that. Well, first of all, remember that there's no evidence of this being actually a tradition. It was. We discussed that last week. It probably was a one-off amnesty, which happened quite a bit.
You know, I always thought that was a thing because I hear it so often in church.
It's in Matthew's gospel, but there's no historic record of it outside of Matthew's gospel. So,
Okay. Wow.
There are historic records of one-off amnesties, of special amnesties. But nothing, no sort of tradition of doing it, every year at Passover. So, but the basic, fact is that regardless of the tradition, and even if it is the tradition, this isn't a democracy. This is,
Yeah.
Palestine is a captive territory
That's right.
controlled by the Romans. So just because somebody wants to free X doesn't mean you want to free X gets freed. Pilate is the governor, and he's responsible for what goes on in Palestine, in Judea. So it's ultimately
Yeah.
his decision.
It just seems that Matthew kind of got a lot of people to believe that Pilate was innocent of the choice. I mean, it really seemed to say that, by his washing his hands. I mean, a lot of people don't know that it's not a tradition of Rome. They just read it in the Bible.
Right.
It's coming from one of the disciples saying,
Right. Yeah, that's true.
in the gospel.
But it is true, even if it is a tradition,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean Pilate gets off free because he is the governor.
Yeah. Up until now, to you making it the point real clear to me now. I always wondered why we were so up in arms against Pilate when he made that statement about washing his hand. And now I know that that's probably never happened. So he's guilty because he should have just made the choice himself.
Well, I would think it probably did happen. He did wash his hands.
Ah, see, one that's kind of throwing me off now because I thought at the beginning you said that he didn't.
No, I mean, I said that many commentators say that he didn't.
Oh, okay.
Because it's from their viewpoint, it's a purely Jewish custom.
Yeah, and it seems odd that a Roman would know that Jewish custom, though.
A Roman would probably not know the Jewish custom, but the thing is that it also is found in Sophocles, and especially most importantly for a Roman prefect, it's found in Virgil.
Oh.
Virgil was, an extremely, and it's found in the Aeneid, in fact, which is, the foundational epic of, the foundation of the Roman state empire. And so I would be surprised if there was any literate Roman who had not read and was not familiar with the Aeneid. I mean, actually, I think that's pretty close to inconceivable that a literate Roman, and especially a Roman official, would not have read the Aeneid. It's kind of, I don't know what a comparable thing say. It's probably a lot like an American not knowing the legend about George Washington and the cherry tree, which, almost certainly never happened. So does that sort of clear up confusion?
No.
No?
No, because a lot of people who read the Bible don't know that stuff you just explained. So
Right.
That's what gets me about it, So that's it should be made clearer to us, because even when we're in church and they talk about this washing of hands, we even go through the ritual of it sometimes in some of when we act it out, and if it's no, but you did say that you agree that there was a washing of hands, so didn't you, Ron?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then yes, I understand.
So Pilate did
I changed
wash
my
his
no to a
hands.
yes.
Pilate did wash his hands to indicate that he was absolved of guilt.
Okay.
The question is he in fact absolved
Whether it
of
was or
guilt
not.
in Matthew's gospel?
No. He's
And the
not.
answer is that no, he's not
not.
absolved of guilt in Matthew's gospel. He's as guilty as everyone else.
Yeah.
He's the governor, a governor who is,
That's his
You know.
position, to make the decisions.
right,
Yeah.
he's supposed to make the decisions. Yeah, that's his responsibility. The death sentence is exclusively his responsibility.
Yeah.
So you would think that, so the encounter between Pilate and Jesus concludes in verse 26. Then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. So on the one hand, scourging was a prelude to crucifixion. So everyone who was to be crucified was supposed to be scourged. And scourging, we tend to see, you get 10 lashes or whatever, and kind of painful, and you have these welts, and it's not good. But
Was it like 39 or something, or something -1?
I'm not sure what the number was. The thing is that the scourging was with the whip. The whip was the end of the whip, the end of the lash had either bone or metal.
Yeah.
And so
Or barbs of some
yeah,
kind.
it
Yeah.
cut into you.
Yeah.
Rip lash
It
off.
wasn't just you got these welts.
Right.
And so many people died from the scourging. It was no laughing matter. So you would think that when you know that somebody is innocent, you would, kind of bend the procedure a little bit, like, maybe we'll just crucify this guy and cut out the scourging, right? But Pilate doesn't do that. He washes his hands, and then Jesus gets like the full meal deal. He gets scourged and then taken to the cross, and then evidently he was injured so badly in the scourging that he can't himself carry the cross. So they have to what is the word?
Assign help.
Consign. Is that it? Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross for Jesus. So that kind of indicates that a total lack of mercy and at least to me once again a total sort of abrogation of responsibility. I mean, you would think that if he was forced to crucify someone against his will, he would at least lighten the burden a little bit, but he just doesn't do that. He goes in sort of whole hog. So then that's followed by the mocking of Jesus by the soldiers. Cyril of Jerusalem, in commenting about this, said, "Every king is proclaimed by soldiers."
Who said that, Rob?
Cyril of Jerusalem.
Mm.
Saint Cyril is well worth reading. He's the author of the catechetical lectures. I think there are like 18 of them, the last 5 of which are called the mystagogical lectures. So the first 13 or whatever are sort of a basic overview of the faith for basically an RCIA program for people who are interested in joining the church. And then the mystagogical lectures are for those who have been baptized at the Easter baptismal ceremony. Mystagogy means the study of the revelation of Christ in the sacraments. So, and Saint Cyril was also a prophet. I can't remember the name of the emperor. In any case, he was the last of Constantine's line. He was hostile to Christianity. He also recognized that persecuting Christianity was counterproductive because it only created martyrs, which fueled the growth of Christianity. And so, from his perspective, the really sensible thing to do to destroy Christianity, Julian the Apostate, the really sensible thing to do to destroy Christianity would be to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And so Saint Cyril prophesied that God would never permit the temple to be rebuilt. And in fact, there was an attempt when construction on the temple was begun. There was an explosion that killed all of the people who were working on the temple.
Aren't there people today that are putting money together to try to build
Yes,
that temple?
yes, yes.
I know somebody that
Yes,
believes that that's what needs to be done.
hopefully not a Catholic.
No, not a Catholic.
Yeah, it's a very common thing. So after the first explosion, there was a new beginning of work to rebuild the temple, ending in a second explosion. And at that point, Julian was assassinated, and that was the end of the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, basically, I would say the same thing really applies to the rebuilding of a new temple today. It's not, I would say that the notion that a temple will be rebuilt is extremely, extremely heretical. It's a complete violation of a Catholic faith. It's a complete violation of Catholic eschatology. It's really a complete violation of everything, and a huge act of disrespect toward our Islamic brethren, since the temple, the Dome of the Rock is there.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most sacred sites in Islam, the site from which Muhammad was said to be assumed into heaven. It's foundational to premillennial dispensationalism and the rapture people. So it's really foundational for evangelical fundamentalist theology, but it is a total departure from Christianity and from the Christian understanding of history and from the Christian understanding of eschatology. It simply is flat out heretical. What did Cyril mean when he said every king is proclaimed by soldiers?
Well, if the army decided that, the king is not supposed to be king, the army gonna attack the king.
Mm-hmm. And also, this is irony. Right? So
he really was the king.
he really was the king, right? They're mocking him. They're making fun of him. He's, at this point, a pathetic figure, right? He's been scourged and badly injured.
I just don't know how they can spit on somebody that's been.
Remember, there's there are several things here. First of all, actually, we should probably look at this in a more systematic way. We're going to run out of time and won't finish. So next week, we'll do this in a little more systematic way by reading Mark and John's account of the scourge of the mocking. But so the troops are almost certainly not Roman soldiers, but are soldiers who were drawn from the surrounding area, but are not Jews. So, because the big thing is that so remember, Romans are always work based on divide and conquer. Romans work on sowing as much internal discord among the subject peoples as possible, making sure that there is as little basis for unity among peoples as possible. So you don't want to have Jewish troops maintaining Roman order in Judah, right? Because that means that they're a potential revolutionary force, right? They can fight against you. And, and so if you have, Jewish troops who are, Jewish liberationists or, insurrectionists, then you're in trouble. So you want to have people who, from the surrounding areas, who don't like the Jews. And, in an area rife with ethnic conflict, that's really easy to do. You just get anybody else, because mostly everybody hates one another. So these are all non-Jews from surrounding area. And they certainly don't have any sympathy for the Jews in general. And since their responsibility is to maintain Roman order, they certainly don't have any sympathy for a supposed Jewish king. So this is mockery. And but the irony is that it's true. In fact, that Jesus is not only, so they're mocking Jesus as King of the Jews, but the irony is not only that Jesus is the King of the Jews, but he's their king as well. So that's what Cyril means by every king is proclaimed by soldiers. They're proclaiming him king. It's mockingly and maliciously, but it happens to be true. They're accidentally speaking the truth. Very much like very much like Pilate was accidentally speaking the truth. And in John's gospel, very much like Caiaphas accidentally spoke the truth. And so, of course, there's also sort of nationalistic mockery. There is no king but Caesar. That's sort of a common phrase. But the irony is that, of course, Jesus is a greater king than Caesar. So in the mockery, Mark has the soldiers putting a purple robe on Jesus, and Matthew has a red robe. Does anyone have any sense of the difference and who might be correct? The purple is the color of royalty, which is why Mark has a purple robe. But the problem is that purple robes or cloaks are really expensive.
Yeah.
They're made from, the purple dye is made from Mediterranean mollusks. And it is extremely, in Roman times, it was extremely expensive. There's a reason that it was the color of the nobility, because ordinarily people could never possibly afford a purple robe. So here we evidently, from Mark's version, evidently just have this purple robe lying around. So red robes would be worn by Roman soldiers. So they're easily accessible. Each of the people abusing Jesus, each of the soldiers abusing Jesus would have one. And so that's why Matthew has a red robe being put on Jesus. What I think is really very interesting about that in turn, so, there's this whole debate about which is the first gospel, and, scholarly consensus is that Mark's is the first gospel and that Matthew copied from Mark, and along with Q and all the rest of this stuff. But the traditional view and the view handed down to us from the fathers is that Matthew's is the first gospel, that Mark copied and abridged. And here we see a detail in Matthew that is clearly accurate. The purple is very, very unlikely to have ever happened. And so we see a change, right? So red isn't good enough. As Matthew said, we have to have purple, which didn't happen. And Mark wasn't there. If we assume that the writer of the Gospel of Matthew is Matthew, the tax collector, he at least knew of it in some form, even though there were only the soldiers were present, but probably word of it leaked out, especially since, as we'll see later, some of the Roman soldiers came to believe that Christ was the Son of God. So this detail, sort of smacks of originality, with Mark's smacking of a change from, a modification of the original, and is one of the points that, I think points to the originality of Matthew's gospel and the fact that Mark's gospel came afterwards. I mean, and there are many more of those, but I think that this is really very, very suggestive. One final quotation about the robe from Saint Cyril. He's taking his comment from Mark, so he says it's a purple robe, but he says the soldiers put on him a purple robe. They did it in mockery, but it was a prophetic act, for he was truly a king. Even if they did it in scorn, they still did it, and this was a symbol of his royal dignity. So that's what Saint Cyril means by every king is proclaimed by soldiers. So why don't we stop there? And we'll continue with the mockery of Jesus next time, and then progress on to the crucifixion, and maybe we'll get to the death of Jesus, but I would have a sneaking suspicion nuts. Yeah, so we'll probably just finish the mockery of Jesus and the crucifixion. Then we'll do the death of Jesus the following week, and probably burial and guard at the tomb the week after that. And then we'll begin chapter 28.